Right. So obviously, thanks for joining in today. We're going to be looking at, continuing on our journey, which is to look at covering learning outcome 2. Now, last time I think we discussed, a couple of things with regards to the introduction to the unit, and also went into a bit more detail, in the learning outcome 1. So basically, this particular unit, as I mentioned earlier, is a bit mix of different units, but essentially focuses on understanding, what is an organization, what has got the topics of leadership and management, how they work, and how do we see them working practically on a day-to-day basis as an organization. We're going to be today looking at understanding structure and culture of the organization. And then in the subsequent learning outcomes, we'll go into understanding performance and, effectiveness, how motivation and, leaders and managers essentially bring in processes which allows employees to be motivated and, get the performance from them and make the organization more effective and productive. And the last one would be focused on, understanding specifically techniques which focus on how, managers and leaders look at essentially motivating employees using schemes, various types of emoluments, as we call them, packages, as we call them, or incentives, as we call them, and we'll get into a bit more detail in that. Now, with the follow-up from the learning outcome 1, we're going to be looking at, in the first learning outcome, just to quickly summarize, we looked at things like, different forms of leadership theories, difference between a leader and a manager, what are leadership styles, and, how we looked at the evolution of, the various theories which have evolved over the decades. So we looked at the 4 broad areas, when we discussed things like the Frederick-Taylor experiment. We looked at Max Weber's bureaucratic, theories. Then we looked at the interpersonal and relationship theories. And then we looked at the post-modern, basically post-World War II modern approach to these theories and how they help leaders and managers build, effective relationships within the organization to be able to lead the organization, get them behind in the singular vision, and obviously get all employees, staff, partners, suppliers to sing from the same songbook or hymn book. And then we looked at some of the leadership behaviors. So different styles, autocratic, democratic, laissez-faire. We looked at, paternalistic. There are lots of different styles which have been identified over the years, but the traditional 4 that we recognize, discuss those. And now, with that understanding, we are going to get into the second learning outcome, which is going to be focused more on understanding what are organizational structures. We talk about organizational structure in various contexts, and we look at that. And then what kind of a culture can actually form from a type of culture, a structure that you see within the organization. So does a structure of the organization have an impact on culture, or vice versa, and how do they work together? How do we see that some organizations which are structured in a particular way show or exhibit a certain type of culture? And that comes, because the way departments functions, people within different, departments and functions, people with different hierarchies, power actually interact, and that is what actually depicts the organizational culture. So we look at understanding those bits, a fair bit of indicative content, which we have to look at in the coverage of learning outcome 2, and that are, kind of recapitulated on this particular slide, which basically looks at understanding the broad cultural, first structure types. Then we look at broad organizational cultures. What are the various theories which psychologists, philosophers, people who have done a good amount of research into various organizations. In particular, we look at Hofstede, Gerard Hofstede, which is a Dutch psychologist, and he did a bit of an experiment in, the IBM as an organization, the International Business Machine, because they had operations in very many countries, and he came up with and proposed a particular model that we will look at. We look at the Harrison's model, which is the 4 broader roles that he's defined in terms of how organization structure influences the culture within the organization. And then we'll also look at Mintzberg, structures, which he has proposed after a lot of research that he's done over the years. But in the 1980s and 90s, we'll also look at some of the work which was done by some of the other psychologists, and they were influenced by obviously studies which have been done by other and previous people, or authors, or psychologists, or philosophers. But we look at Fiedler's learning organization in particular, because nowadays a lot of organizations are focused on training and development. And why does a learning organization tend to be, or organizations which are learning or termed as learning organizations tend to be more successful? Because there's continuous focus on training and development. And as most leaders and managers recognize that, people tend to be one of the most important resources which can control some of the other resources in the organization. The Fiedler's proposition of the 11 characteristics of how we see organizations being learning organizations, being able to adapt to various concepts of changes in technology, globalization, those kind of bits. And we will also look at, so his particular model is also quite useful when we look at understanding cultures within and structures within the organization. And this particular learning outcome focuses on 3 assessment criteria. So one of them is to understand the different types of structures that we want to do. The second one talks about how does a particular structure help in the development of a particular culture or a type of culture within the organization. And in the merit part, we're going to be looking at evaluating. That means we need to look at studying a particular organization as an example to see how do we, personally, from an experience point of view, or theoretically from the learning that we do today from learning outcomes, see that how do we put and recognize that this organization has this culture, and this culture can lead to, this structure, and this structure can lead to generation or formation of this particular type of culture, which is seen generally being depicted by employees. And is that structure, is that culture effective? Is that structure, beneficial organization in terms of its performance and, for productivity, for efficiency? We look at that with a bit of an example. So what I'm going to do is, as usual, start off with a bit of key terminology and look at, going through some of the key bits of terms which are going to be, important for this learning outcome. Now, we've all heard about organizations, so we know what is an organization. But because of the pandemic, and obviously a lot of people working from home, the new normal, WFH, as we call it, working from home, a lot of companies have started to look at structures. It's not something new, but it's become, it's like in the headlines nowadays, is because a lot of organizations which have lots of employees, small, medium, large organizations, they have all also worked during the course of lockdowns and, intermittent opening up of the economy and lockdown again. So what we've seen in the last 15 months is a lot of organizations are talking about something called virtual organization. So when we talk about virtual organization, a couple of things come to our mind. So one of those things is that, okay, it's virtual would mean you can't physically see it or physically, create a structure, but it could be virtual because it's spread across in different locations. And it could be because the staff which is working within the organization is in different locations. There's a bit of a coordination which tends to happen to be able to make things work. So when we talk about virtual organization, we are talking about, a flexible network of independent entities. The reason I say independent entities is when you look at a global business which has lots of branches, or a company which has lots of branches, a business which is spread across in different countries, you would generally see that the company works in a very coordinated manner, and they use certain tools and techniques to be able to coordinate that. So when we see such organizations and individuals working within such organizations, working together, interacting, using technology, or, basically using pieces of technology which allow them to work seamlessly together to be able to produce an output, we will generally see that that kind of an organization would depict what is called a virtual organization structure. So here, employees would work from home. They might work from regional offices, shared, business centers, and that is what we've got to see during the pandemic. That because of the flexibility, because of the lockdowns, a lot of employers have ensured, in order to continue the business, they've ensured that employees could work from flexible, work using flexible ways. And in one of those things, when we talk about flexible ways, is use of technology and use of different locations to be able to work together, but still at the end of the day, they are a part of the same team and get the job done. Now, virtual also comes across, because if we literally go into, the meaning of the word virtual, we'll also basically go and see that, okay, sometimes when you have to go beyond boundaries, when you have to describe things which are not, let's say, adhering to a strict definition of a form or a particular structure, then in those cases also you would use and see that virtual organizations get formed. So in some cases, these would be related to a company, say in the UK, if you look at a company like Tesco, or you look at a company like Marks and Spencer, which has operations in very, very countries. They operate in multiple sites. In those cases, when people work together but still are able to collaborate and work in teams and produce the output which is required, or reach the objectives, you would generally see that these organizations would be called, virtual organizations. A virtual organization would be a good example of that would be UK Versity. So if we look at virtually, we are working collectively as a team, but the team is spread across in a number of locations in the UK, and that is where we see that when it comes to delivering teaching and learning, it doesn't matter whatever place, what time, where, which location you're in, but technology helps us come together and obviously effectively look at delivering, what we are delivering in terms of teaching and learning or lectures. Now, when we talk about, in the first learning outcome, we talked about what is called, we looked into a bit of detail into what is organization and what is organization behavior. So when we talk about OB, organization behavior, we talked about a link between how people actually work together when they're put together in a particular network or a structure. So the essential bit in terms of how do we define organizational behavior is mostly related to how people or individuals would behave in a particular setting. And this will be based on, certain variables. It could be variables which are things like, what responsibility you have, what is a job responsibility or day-to-day work that you do, what kind of authority or your title of your job. And in some cases, what is the power that you wield in terms of, because of your, hierarchy within the organization. So this particular branch of science, which basically is looking at the study of both individuals and a group of individuals which are put together in a shape or structure to be able to do or accomplish a particular work or accomplish a particular goal, would be an organization. But the behavior or the study of basically understanding how these things work within an organization would be termed as, organization behavior. Now, in terms, when we are already talking in terms of things like individuals, groups, teams working together, so in some way or other, we are already alluding to the fact that when we talk about organizations, businesses, or, companies, essentially, they would have some sort of a structure. And these structures would essentially get formed because of various different types of things. It could be because you do or your colleagues do the same type of function. So if you're in marketing and there is another colleague in marketing, there's another colleague in marketing, and there is a few other colleagues in marketing, but if they are doing different things, but they are all classed under one banner. So for example, somebody's handling advertising, somebody's handling PR, somebody's handling events, somebody's handling websites or digital side of things, and somebody's looking at, coordinating all this together. What you'll generally see is that this would be a grouping of individuals performing a similar set of functions, at least from a departmental point of view, but they'll have to be further departmentalized or clubbed together to be saying that, okay, these are set of people who carry out marketing activities for the organization. So again, we're talking about groupings. If you look at it from a point of view of engineering, a lot of people who work within the production lines and manufacturing, they will all be working within shifts, 8-hour shifts, 6-hour shifts, but they will all have pretty much, similar job roles and responsibilities. Yes, you might be working on, in a car factory, if I look at somebody's working on the assembly of, the engine, somebody is working on the assembly of, say, for example, the interior of the car, somebody's working on the exterior, but they are all essentially working together in the same department. And again, we see groupings happening. Now, when we see this increasingly happening within organizations, and the reason why this is being done is because it should look at setting some sort of a structure, giving it some sort of a semblance, maybe divide, division of work in terms of ensuring that the larger task gets divided into smaller parts, and each of the smaller parts or jobs can be easily done by a group of individuals. And then because they're working within the same department or the same side of the organization or with similar functions, you would generally see that they'll be classed into some sort of a structure. So when we look at different organizations and when we look at different when we do interact with different people in different organizations, you would generally see that they come across from a different department. And a practical example of this would be when you see somebody and you go and introduce yourself, or if you're having a meeting with a client, you normally first flash out a business card. And the moment you flash out a business card, the first thing that you see on the business card is the name of the individual, and underneath that you see a particular title. And that title will tell you which department or which particular setting the employee or the staff actually is coming from. So if you meet somebody in finance and it says finance manager, that means you can understand that the person actually works within the finance function of the company or the department of the company. If you see sales, business development, account manager, they might be coming across from, sales primarily. If you see somebody like events marketing or advertising or PR, they might come from the marketing department. If you see somebody coming across from HR or payroll or, for example, training and development or quality, they might be coming from the HR department. So groupings and the structures through which we see this happening is because the organizations, in order to make or establish, say, for example, the way in which work gets done, they have to look at some sort of structures, and these structures then give rise to, or these groupings essentially then give rise to formal structures, which is what we are going to study and see in this particular learning outcome. So when you look at your organization, or if you've worked in a place wherein you see your organization, you'd be able to recognize when we go through some of these slides that, okay, my organization has this type of a structure. Is that okay? Now, broadly, we will look at, identifying some of the structures which are generally accepted as norms. So when we talk about structures, we look at different types of structures, and these different types of structures that we talk about, could be structures which are predominantly 4 different types. So you will have structures which are related to what I called hierarchical structures. You'll have structures which are related to what are called functional structures. You have divisional structures. You have a flat structure, and in some cases you have a mix of the hierarchical and functional structure, which is called the matrix structure. Now, if I have to explain different structures, it is going to be quite easy for us to go through these, because when we look at some of the organograms which I've got on the screen right now, if you look at this particular organogram, which is primarily coming across, with the top and then further somebody down and then further dividing into functions or going into further, heads, and then each of the department or the heads further then having different people working within the department. Now, this kind of a structure you would generally see is hierarchical. So what you see is as it goes up, it starts becoming a pyramid. So at the base, you have more employees. In the mid, you have just the managers, and on the top, you just have the top management of the CEO. So this kind of structure wherein people report from downwards to upwards is basically going to be classed as hierarchical structure. Then you look at functional structure. So within the hierarchical structure, we could also have a functional structure. If it's a very large organization, let's take an example of Microsoft or any of the large organizations like Google, Apple. You look at Starbucks, any organization which has, operations in very many countries. Zara, for example, you would see that these organizations will also have something called a, functional structure. But what we are looking at here when we say functional structure is that within a particular department, you will see that there are a number of people working within the organization. Now, if this organization is small, if you look at this particular structure and start looking in for spotting this in a small organization, you normally see that this will turn into a flat structure, because there might be just, say for example, you have the general manager IT or director IT, and underneath that you have 3-4 different managers, IT administrator, networks, manager, or you'll have somebody who's probably, say a help desk manager, or maybe an architect, IT architect. Now, if it's a smaller organization, you'll normally see that the IT manager will pretty much do everything, networking, software, architect, designing everything in terms of networks. And because the size of the organization is small, you would normally see that person would do multiple roles. But functional would mean that you are going into a particular department, you're going into a particular branch or a strategic business unit, which has the same set of the employees or people working within that setup would have the similar functions which are broadly related to each. But so in this case, you have a security manager, you have an IT manager, network administrator, you have an IT architect, you have a help desk technician. all these are similar functions and they can be all classed under IT, and that is why it's a functional structure. So when I give you an example of marketing, events, PR, Marcom, advertising, website or digital, and then you look at traditional, ATL advertising or BTL that we do, you would normally see that as a functional structure because all the people carrying out those jobs and responsibilities are from one department. Now, there are organizations wherein you'll see horizontal or flat structure. As you see this particular, image, it shows a flat structure. There's not too much hierarchy. There are not many varied levels in the structure of the organization. And because it could be a startup, it could be a small organization, or it could be an organization wherein, the hierarchy is such that individually people contribute to those functions, you would normally see a flatter structure developing in such organizations. These could be mostly consultancies, partnerships. When you look at solicitor firms, accountancy firms, you would generally see a lot of partners get added on. They're all at the same hierarchy. Nobody's senior, superior, or junior. You have some of them who are going to be called senior partners because they own majority of the share. But some of the other partners who work within the firm, they'll all be at the employee level, but most of them will have some sort of a shareholding. And some of them might be, in some cases, coming from different functions. So somebody might be representing family law, somebody might be representing, for example, commercial law, somebody might be doing, immigration law, but they are individuals or specialists in their own field. This could be also found in a startup organization. Initially, when the organization starts, you normally have fewer people in the organization. The accessibility to the top management or the CEO, the director, or the owner of the organization is there with all the people who work. But as the business begins to grow, the organizations become bigger. You would generally see this kind of a structure would branch out into either a functional, hierarchical, or even a matrix structure. And then in the last, we talk about divisional structure. So when we talk about divisional structure, what we do get to see is that a big organization, you would normally find this. So when you have Google India, you have Google Middle East, you have Google Europe, and then you have Google US or Americas. Similarly, when you have organizations which have large strategic business units, each unit is big in itself, with that it contributes a lot of revenue and turnover to the organization. And the unit itself, or a division, as we call it, the SBU, the word division is coming from strategic business unit. So the division itself contributes a lot of revenue and is that big that it has its own structure within it. Then in those cases, we will look at what are called divisional structures. Now, the reason why divisional structures is, if I look at, I can give you name a company and I can tell you which structure they fall in. So if I talk about Microsoft, for example, if you go to Microsoft's website, you would generally see that Microsoft is organized in a way wherein they are basically selling or, orienting themselves from a customer standpoint of view through a product-based strategy. And in this case, if I look at Microsoft's website, they tend to be more or less functional or productized, because there, if you see the menu of the website or the way people interact with the website, you would see it talks about Office, Windows, Surface, Xbox, which is gaming, and then you have deals. But yes, if you go into the corporate section of the website, you generally see, there are other bits and pieces which are here underneath. And again, talks about Microsoft Store, which is online. They're big in education, enterprise. They are also having a developer side of community and obviously a basic minimum link for the company. So in some cases, you would see a productized structure, which is an adaptation to, you would say, essentially, the functional structure. And if I go into, say, an organization like Apple, for example, and if I go into an organization like Apple, again, spread across in many, many countries, again, if you look at how they are marketing or, positioning themselves, they follow what is a productized or a functional structure. You go into Macs, it's a division within the, organization itself. You go to iPads, they're big divisions of the company, which basically, look at driving business in billions of dollars. And in each of these divisions, you would generally see that they will have their own structures that we could form very clearly. If I talk about, iPad would basically lend into, say, for example, product engineering, software, the iOS side of things. They will also be, looking at taking services from the global marketing office and then regional offices to be able to bring those products into market. And you see a close coordination happening between all such divisions. So here, the top structure that we see overarching would be a productized or a functional structure, but the moment you start dwelling deeper into it, you would generally see that these large products at teams would have their own hierarchical and let's say horizontal structures, which would be giving support to the side of the business in order to generate revenue. So when we talk about the characteristics and different types of structures, we need to be dwelling into each of these structures and with detail go and try and understand how these structures actually work. So let's look at the first assessment criteria. I will look at watching a bit of a video before I get into explaining how do we look at understanding an organizational structure and where do we see that this structure is actually being put into practice by leaders and managers. So let's listen into this short video, which is a video which was produced by the magazine Digital, and they basically interviewed Steve Jobs to try and understand what kind of a structure and the workings, what kind of a working structure does Apple have, and it's coming in from the horse's mouth. So obviously he's no longer there, but this is a very good piece of short video which shows and helps us grasp that the organization would depict this particular culture and this particular structure because of the way the organization actually works from top down, or the reason because this is how Steve Jobs sees his organization. So let's listen.
Your personal role have different stories about it. That you ranging all the way from you design it personally to you to reuse this word, you kind of curate the suggestions of the people who worked on your human. Give us a sense of that without breaking any of your rules about product secrecy. What do you do?
One of the keys to Apple is Apple's an incredibly collaborative company. And so, you know how many committees we have at Apple?
No.
0. We have no committees.
No committees.
We are organized like a startup. One person's in charge of iPhone OS software. One person's in charge of Mac hardware. One person's in charge of iPhone hardware engineering. Another person's in charge of worldwide marketing. Another person's in charge of operations. We're organized like a startup. We're the biggest startup on the planet. And we all meet for 3 hours once a week, and we talk about everything we're doing, all business. And there's tremendous teamwork at the top of the company, which filters down to tremendous teamwork throughout the company. And teamwork is dependent on trusting the other folks to come through with their part without watching them all the time, but trusting that they're going to come through with their parts. And that's what we do really well. And we're great at figuring out how to divide things up into these great teams that we have and all work on the same thing, touch bases frequently, and bring it all together into a product. We do that really well. And so what I do all day is meet with teams of people and work on ideas and solve problems to make new products, to make new marketing programs, whatever it is.
And are people willing to tell you you're wrong?
Yeah.
I mean, other than snarky journalists. I mean, people that work.
Oh, yeah. No, we have wonderful arguments.
And do you win them all?
Oh, no, I wish I did. You can't. If you want to hire great people and have them stay working for you, you have to let them make a lot of decisions, and you have to be run by ideas, not hierarchy. The best ideas have to win. So otherwise, good people don't stay.
But you must be more than a facilitator who runs meetings. You obviously contribute your own ideas.
I contribute ideas, sure. Well, why would I be there if I didn't?
So if you see this particular video, and now if we relate to what we are actually studying in terms of structures, there are some key giveaways which, Steve Jobs, he mentions in this particular video. So this video is coined as, or termed as, Apple structure. So he says, we have great collaborative teams. he says different people work on different products. So when you look at this and you look at understanding how Apple is structured, you get a very clear sense of idea that, okay, the company is actually working or structured in a way wherein they talk about functional or productized hierarchy. They talk about a lot of independence. They talk about, he talked about essentially that a lot of people will come through and deliver on their tasks that they're supposed to. And the structure basically creates a culture which basically promotes collaboration in basically working between individuals and teams. And the last thing that he mentions very clearly is that he talks about that I do meetings all day. I meet a lot of people. And what he does when he meets a lot of people, he's basically working collaboratively and, working with people from different teams and then reviewing in terms of what they're actually looking at, delivering at the end of the day. So when we talk about, structures and when we talk about cultures, there are two things that we want to look at from every leader's point of view, every manager's point of view. How are the teams going to be productive, and what they're doing, is it going to be effective enough to reach the end result? These are the two words that we need to remember will always come around, and we'll discuss most of the things around what is a structure, what is a culture, how does it affect each other, is there a bearing which the structure has on the culture of the organization. And the reason why all this is being discussed is that sometimes when we talk about, I'm quite demotivated within the organization, I don't feel like working in my job. When you get to hear these terms, why these are coming across is because somewhere, somehow, the culture of the organization is not suiting your expectation. Maybe it's too bureaucratic. Maybe you're not getting the right opportunities. Maybe you're not having having enough motivation to be able to carry out the roles and responsibilities. Maybe the salary or the wages or the emoluments or compensation that you get for the services that you offer aren't enough. And all these things are basically reflective of the culture. If I talk about culture also very briefly at this stage, sometimes you see in certain organizations there's a certain dress-up style. So if you look at production, engineering, manufacturing organizations, construction organizations, they're all organized from a point of view of uniform as well. So generally, if you go into a construction site, you will see workers wearing a different kind of a jacket, and that is to different color scheme, color coding. You go to a hospital, you would see a lot of staff within the hospital wearing different types of, let's say, clothing. Some of them will be purple, violet, you'll have white, you'll have green, and you'll have, obviously practice managers dressed as dressed in formals or casuals. So when you see all this, it is also reflecting the culture of the organization, or how much tolerant is the organization in terms of accepting the individual's behavior and how you behave within the organization. Now, if we go into the structure of the organization of how he was dictating, we see this coming across. So he's productized them. There are different senior vice presidents who report or would report into him, but now it's Tim Cook. And then he has different independent functions, which basically, go into each of the individual functions where they are required to contribute. And then, the organization runs as an organized unit. So when we talk about Apple in general, if I have to take that example because you've seen a video, I would classify Apple having a traditional hierarchical structure with a mix of elements of functions and product-based groupings. Because the way we see the website, it's all productized. The way we see how the divisions or the structures in terms of grouping of people has been done, it is basically highly productized or functional. Now, when we talk about some of the other types of structures very briefly, let's look at them and in their characteristics, because the task is talking about, in this task you have to basically talk about what are the structures and what are the characteristics and how you can recognize these structures. So as I mentioned to you, hierarchical organizations would normally be, showing a pyramid structure wherein you generally see the base of the pyramid or the number of people working at the lower or front end of the organization will be large, and you would generally go up like a pyramid and you would see people then would have supervisors, there will be lesser managers, and then somebody at the top or a few people at the top in terms of the board, and that is why these are hierarchical organizations. Now in hierarchical organizations, you will also see, when we look at this pyramid that is in front of you on the slide, you see generally what happens is If you see you're lower in the pyramid, you carry out day-to-day responsibilities, basic functions of the business. When you're slightly up in that pyramid, you're basically looking after reviewing certain day-to-day operations and responsibilities to ensure that the output at the end of the day is done or reached, or output at the end of the week is reached. Then you are slightly up in the hierarchy, you will be responsible for looking at certain functions. So you're either a department head or you're essentially supervising a number of people and are responsible for the output that these people produce at the end of the day or at the end of the month. Excuse me. So you would have people like maybe the managers, like a sales manager. You'll have people carrying qualitative targets which are to be delivered at the end of the month, at the end of the quarter, and at the end of the year. And at the top, you'll have people who are basically responsible for budgeting, overall direction, setting the vision, and also ensuring that the organization is able to achieve and reach the targets which have been set by the top management of the board. Okay. Then when we talk about hierarchical organizations, we can look at some advantages and disadvantages. So when we talk about some advantages and disadvantages, some of them could be, if you look at the structure itself, you would generally see the decision making which is going to happen in the organization can happen maybe quite quickly because it's going to be centered or pretty much, available with the key members or somewhere in the top hierarchy of the pyramid. The other things that you will also see is that because the direction and overall, priorities in the business is set by the top people in the top side of the pyramid, you would generally see that the communication in this case will always flow downwards. Does not mean that there's no going to be bidirectional communication. Communication will happen from staff at the front end to supervisors to managers, but generally you would see in terms of direction of the company, main sides of the communication in terms of what is to be accomplished, how the goals and objectives are set, you would generally see that happening from top to bottom. You would also see very clear roles being defined because people in the front end would have a job sheet, people in the slightly higher hierarchy would have something or a job description, and people in the managerial or departmental side would be, having a job description, but also have targets which are qualitative targets that they need to achieve. And then you have the board, which is essentially going to be responsible for the overall mission, vision, strategy, and long-term planning for the organization. Now, some of the disadvantages in this structure would be that because everything is top-driven or owner-driven, depending on the scale and size of the organization, you will suddenly see that sometimes decision-making is not going to be delegated. Decision-making is going to be, top-centric. You will also see, because if there are a number of hierarchies or number of levels in the organization, because of the way the organization is structured, you can see sometimes communication lapses happen, delays in communication which could happen. And in some cases, you would feel that the frontline staff at some stage could also, in large organizations, very large organizations which employ thousands and thousands of people, might feel that they don't have any touch with the top management. And in some cases, getting the feedback across or getting some of the qualitative feedback across to the top management would be very difficult. So they feel they're quite insignificant. They just get paid the basic hourly wage, or in some cases get paid, for the job they're doing, and the culture tends to be more task-oriented. So in those cases, you would see that there are going to be some advantages and some disadvantages of this type of structure. And you would see this happening in organizations wherein you would normally, either they are going to be a startup, there could be organizations which are very well established, and to a certain extent in some organizations where the culture of the country or the way the organization is structured, the way or from which the business is started, you would also see this kind of structure coming across. So when we look at Japanese companies in particular, you would see that they have a hierarchical structure in most cases. So the top man, and you normally get to see that in the news, that if the organization defaults or if the organization commits a mistake and if there are financial frauds and things like that, you would generally see the top management of the organization would publicly, bow and, accept responsibility in front of the organization or in front of the members of public. So in these cases, you would generally see hierarchical organizations being there because of the culture from which the organization or business originates, and in some cases because the way they are structured when the business is started off. The second type of structure that we look at is flat. Now, flat structure could be flat, and this is not a very good depiction of a flat structure, but the reason of this image is if you see a flat structure, you see the people who are in charge at each individual level have a lot of people underneath them. So essentially here the organization is maybe into a single business, or it has very fewer layers which require any improvisation in terms of, improvisation in terms of addition of manpower. A simple example of this I would give you is when you look at sometimes project organizations. You normally see the project organizations tend to have a flat structure. Startup businesses tend to have a flat structure. You might see a large organization which is into a single product, or they have a single type or category of products that they sell to consumers. You would normally see them having a flat structure, or they will have a flat, the structure in those organizations is going to be flat. The reason is, if I look at Procter & Gamble, or if you look at Unilever. Now, Procter & Gamble and Unilever are very large, fast-moving consumer good companies. They have over 200 products in their portfolio. So if I just talk detergents, for example, you have lots of different types of products which are there. If you just talk soaps, there are lots of different brands of soap. So in those cases, you would not find a flat structure in the organization. Now, flat structure in the organization would come in organizations which are into one particular industry. So you see construction industry. If they are into construction, they might be constructing a bridge, they might be constructing houses, buildings, train stations, whatever it is. But here, the collection of individuals and the type of people working within the organization would be of one particular type, and they would all come from some sort of an engineering, civil construction, architectural kind of a background. And here, when I talk about a project team, you would generally see that the project team would have a project manager at the top, a lead project manager or a project manager on the top, and there'll be several other smaller, project managers who would be looking at different functions. So if I look at the construction side and visualize it, you generally see that some of these people would be, if there's a large building being constructed, somebody would be responsible for the whole project. Underneath that, you have 3 or 4 different project managers. One of them is responsible for construction, one for materials management, one for ensuring that, the site gets ready on time, and then the internals within the office and other, or whatever is being built, hotel, office, residential complex, is being also, furnished or is being completed before the next level of floors and other things go up. So you would normally see that as to be a flat structure. And under the project manager, they will have their own project teams. So there'll be a constructions project team, there'll be a materials management project team, there'll be a head office project team, which is looking into all the side of things like budgeting, manpower, recruitment, and things like that, disbursements, which they do. And these are kind of organizations you would normally see having the structure. A startup business could have a flat structure because the number of people working in the organization is small. And at some stage, you would generally see that these organizations, as they expand, the structures would change. Now, going back to the example of Unilever. Go on.
Interrupt you, Raman.
Go on.
So what is the difference between flat and hierarchical structure? Because from where I am looking at it, it seems to be quite similar.
So flat structure is, as the name suggests, flat structure is going to be flat. That means there are lesser layering or layers within the business or within the organization. So if you see a flat structure organization, you normally see there's somebody who's a director, underneath you have a general manager, and then you have all the people working, which is primarily managers or sales executives. It's a small organization with lesser layers, and because of the lesser layers, the structure is flat. So when I say,
then we have companies who are just focusing on one industry. In that, we won't have multiple departments. So lack of multiple departments will be like there will be less roles to manage and the team to manage. So in that type of organizations, we can assume that flat structure will be followed.
Yeah, so the only word that I would replace in your explanation would be, I would not say department, I would say lesser layers in terms of management. So you will have lesser people with power or lesser people with the ability to make decisions, and because that layering is less, the management layers are less, you would generally see that kind of an organization would have a flat structure. So
So we
it
can
will be,
categorize it into like small scale companies usually.
you could have
Like
startups, small scale organizations where, yes, definitely, you could have startups, you could have even large organizations which are into one category of products or are functioning within one city, or they are basically located in one country. And in some cases, you would look at those organizations having a flat structure. But when I say a flat structure and a difference between hierarchical structure, the only difference that I would be able to use and say, because sometimes you can see mixture and mergers of these structures also being present within companies. So one of the key characteristics which differentiates flat from hierarchical is that the layers in terms of decision-making authority are less. So you would generally see management layers being abolished. Sometimes you would see when companies are looking at making redundancies, the first people to take a walk or the first people to be made redundant are managers, because they are managing a set of people who are dealing with the front end or representing the front end of the organization. And in order to, kind of thin the organization or reduce the, let's say the outgoings, management would normally take a decision of getting away with the, layer which is managing them. And that would mean they get rid of one particular layer, and that would create a less straighter or a flatter structure, help in the cost savings. And that is where you would say flat organization, or they're flattening the organization. You look at a typical example of mergers and acquisition. So when you look at two companies merging, there are lots of functions which are similar. You have marketing departments, you have sales, product, engineering, purchase, administration, operations. So when that kind of a function, you see this merger happening, you would see that one of the key responsibilities of the HR is to look at sorting out or managing the most important employees. When I say most important, means shortlisting employees which have the skill set, which are going to be required to work in the new side of the organization, knowledge, experience, and loyalty factor towards the organization, and they would be kept. And some of the other managers or people who normally do not have the skills required to function in the combined merged organization in the future would be allowed to let go. And in some cases, what you generally see is people in the managerial side of things, they want to get rid of the managerial layer. So they basically look at delayering, and in the delayering, you would see that they try and flatten the organization to try and reduce costs and duplication of efforts which could happen because of people within the organization. So an organization with or let's say with minimal middle management, I would class it as flat organization, or minimal layers in the middle management. Minimal layers in the middle management would be flat organization. But an organization which has a number of middle management layers, so you have when you sometimes look at organizations, you see a title and you say he's a sales executive, you have senior sales executive, you have assistant manager, then you have a manager, senior manager, then you have assistant general manager. What you're seeing is layers. And this kind of an organization would give you an idea that this is hierarchical. And when you see sales executive, you see a sales manager, you see a general manager, and you see a director of sales, or, in that routine marketing or whatever function, you see that the organization is much flatter, having delayered or done away with a lot of layers of management, middle management, and that is why it will be hierarchical, but still, I would, depending on, if it's a large organization and it's productized, it will still be hierarchical because you'll have a general manager, a manager, a number of managers in that geography selling. If it's a large organization like HP or Microsoft, or if you look at, Tesco stores or any other retail store like Reliance in India, for example, you have within a state, you'll have maybe, hundreds of managers, and they would report into a regional manager, and a regional manager would report into a state manager. So in those cases also, yet it is having lesser structure in terms of hierarchy, but I would still, because of the size and scale of the organization and the services they deliver, or the products and services they sell to consumers, I will still class that as hierarchical. But overall, in the scheme of things, if the same structure was there, because they're only India-based, but if that organization was present in Europe or Americas and other geographies, then in those cases, that structure would be still deemed as flat, because the layering between, the middle management or there is lesser layering within the middle management.
Mm-hmm.
Is that okay?
Okay. Yeah.
Now, we look at different advantages and disadvantages of, again, flat structure of systems. So if you see a flat structure within an organization, you would normally see decision making is faster, communication is quicker. You would see sometimes flat structure also makes the P&L of the company much bigger or fatter because of the fact that there are no middlemen in the middle in terms of taking decisions, authorizing decisions. And in some cases, you would see, because the person carrying responsibility has far greater responsibility as compared to if there are 2 or 3 people carrying that responsibility, that also makes the organization much more profitable and, let's say, leaner and meaner. Now, some of the disadvantages tend to be that too much decision making is, affiliated with one person or one, particular layer. And you would also see sometimes in these organizations, people tend to leave or feel less motivated because they've worked for a number of years. They get the usual, rises in salaries, but obviously there's no job enlargement in the sense of responsibility, and there is no promotional opportunities for them to get into senior roles. Because here, what you would generally see from an HR perspective is in these organizations, people tend to, get frustrated because they're not getting promotions or enough, let's say, praise for the work and the amount of work that they bring or contribute in terms of bringing to the organization. So generally, motivation in such organizations, depending if it's a large one, but this tends to be a generic drawback or a disadvantage that, promotions and raises or other bits and pieces related to, enlargement of job responsibility does not happen very frequently. People have to be content in their own roles and responsibilities that they have assigned. And you generally see that people in these organizations, tend to either stay for long, and in some cases, you would generally see that some of these organizations have a high amount of staff turnover. Now, similarly, we look at productized and brand structure. So productized and brand structure, we've already covered this with the Apple example. You would generally see there are lots of advantages and disadvantages. And the advantages that are clear is that there is a focus from a management perspective to look into what the customer needs. And the products of the organization or the services of the organization are very consumer oriented. So one of the things that you normally see now with organizations is when you look at Starbucks, you look at Costa Cafe, you look at some of the other organizations in the customer experience space. Not probably take an example of Apple, it's too easy, is that they only focus on what is called customer experience. So they look at things from a customer's perspective and what customers would want in terms of benefits and advantages when they buy their products. So Apple is an organization which is extremely focused on user experience, but their products are also very high priced. But when you look at some of the other organizations like Starbucks, when you go and have a good cup of coffee or a chai latte or a coffee latte, you normally see for about £3, £4 for a cup, you are getting the same amount of service, and there is a lot of thought process and thinking which goes into when the service is offered from one of the Starbucks stores. So here the focus is primarily on product, the focus is primarily on user experience and customer experience and what kind of experience they get from the brand and how they help in creating brand association. So there are lots of advantages of having a product and brand structure or productized functional structure, which is what we get to see in a lot of companies which are selling directly to consumers now. The disadvantage tend to be that in some of these businesses, there is a lot of competition. And obviously, if you're focused predominantly on service, and if there is something is to go wrong, for example, when you look at Samsung. Now, Samsung has made successive attempts to bring out a folding phone. But because they've successively failed, and now they've again brought out a new phone, which is the Z Flip and, a foldable phone, and it's being termed as third time lucky. Consumers sometimes are not very forgiving if they've had a bad experience because these products are very expensive. So at $2,200, a folding phone, and if it doesn't work or meet your expectation, it basically creates a very negative experience about the whole brand and the way you perceive the company. So sometimes you would see that this brings across a lot of negatives because the company is, single-mindedly focused on customer experience or user experience. Then we talk about, geographical structures. Now, geographical structures would be a combination of divisional and functional structure. I would also term them as, matrix structure, because you would generally see the organizations have different types of operations, and these operations can be either grouped as product type or they can be grouped as on the basis of geographical locations. And because of these, you would generally see that this helps the organization reach out to consumers or do or transact business in a much more efficient and productive way. Now, when we talk about the four broad types of structures, there are further specialized, structures which have developed over the years by looking at these four broader types. Now, sometimes we will also see what is called a specialization structure. Now, what is a specialization structure? This is a specialization structure when we talk about, say, a software company, like we talk about Facebook or Google or LinkedIn. You generally see that the division of work within this organization and the tasks and functions which the members of the organization do are going to be specific to applying a particular type of knowledge. So it will be a case of a lot of programmers working on coding. There'll be a lot of programmers who will be working on, understanding what customers want, and a lot of data is being collected from consumer research, which then feeds into creating of products and storyboards, and then finally goes into coding at some stage when it is approved, and then testing, and then finally, alpha stage, then beta stage, and finally goes into, production to sell to consumers. So in those cases, what you'll see is these organizations, when they look at recruitment, these organizations, when they look at, hiring, you would generally see that they have a very specialist requirement in terms of skill set which is required. So if you want to be a software engineer in Apple, you need to be able to learn or know at least Cocoa. You need to be able to understand Python and Visual C as a programming language if you have to apply to a programmer's role. And this is a specialist area. So if you don't have this skill set, there's no way that you'll be able to apply for that job role. You can't even, think of applying, because these are the skill sets which have been specified when you look at the job advert. And in this case, you would look at specialization. And specialization can be vertical and horizontal. So vertical, when we talk about, this term basically comes across when we say, sometimes you look at companies expanding organically, companies expanding inorganically, companies doing vertical integration, companies doing horizontal integration. So when we talk about, vertical specialist structures, you would generally see that these are, let's say, organizations wherein you would normally refer to one particular department, and that particular department would have various smaller, functions which are related, and that give it the total capability to basically look at managing everything within the company itself. So when I look at vertical and horizontal integration, so when we talk about vertical integration, we are basically looking at, companies essentially doing or combination of work which is being done, which could be done in 2 or 3 different companies. That work is being done within one such organization. So here it is referring to the arrangement of supply chain or people who work within different functions, but they are going to be all owned within the company. So when you look at software organizations, because software is their intellectual property, you generally see that testers, programmers, coders, architects, or basically people who come up with the ideas on which patents are filed, they are all a part and parcel of the organization. There's no outsourcing in such organizations. But when we look at horizontal, let's say, specialization, here you would see that some part of the work could have been outsourced, because here there are different levels, there are different requirements and different skill sets. So sometimes you would see these kind of organizations would buy what are called SDKs, software development kits. So they would work with other companies very closely to use that SDK to integrate into their product. And one such example that I would give you is essentially when you look at NVIDIA, which is a graphics company, you look at GeForce, which is a product that they bring out. And when you look at a graphics card, because the graphics card, or you look at companies like ARM, which produces processors, you look at, various chip companies, for example, they can't be monopolistic. They can't say that, okay, we will produce everything which is required to go into the chip on our own. So in some cases, what they do is they will produce basic parts of it. Some part of it will be outsourced or coming from different similar companies or operations. And this is done primarily to spread the work, reduce the cost, and in some cases, speed up the output which is required. And when we look at that, you would generally see horizontal specialization being applied in those companies. Now, one such example of, there are lots of examples, but one such example which I would primarily mention is when you talk about, TSMC, or when you talk about Intel, for example. Now, these companies, when they look at producing, TSMC is Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, Samsung, which produces memory and chips. These companies essentially have a lot of components which come into the chip from different other suppliers. So here, in order to rather replicate and spend time, effort, money within the organization to produce all those, some part of it is outsourced, but the assembly part of it happens within the company because they need to do it according to their requirements or their customers' requirement. So in those cases, you would see some organizations also having specialist structures, and these specialist structures can be horizontal and can be vertical because of supply chain issues or integration with the supply chain. Now, we also look at very briefly, when we talk about structures, there is decentralization and there is centralization. So when we talk about decentralization and centralization, any ideas? What does that mean?
One is like internal decision of the organization, and one is like when there are different stakeholders who are not directly involved in the organization, maybe.
So yes, you're pretty close. Yes. So when you look at decentralization, what we mentioned is that the decision-making process in this case is delegated. In an organization wherein there is high responsibility, there is highly skilled manpower, and people are generally very motivated or loyal to the organization, you would see that the structure of the organization, whichever hierarchy you follow, you would normally see a decentralized structure, because here the decision-making power is assigned at different levels within the organization. And this happens because of the different team structures, the different variability of work which happens from time to time. And you would normally see that happening in projectized organizations or organizations which work on projects, essentially. And when we see the reverse of that happening, wherein the authority, the decision-making power is all centered in one particular department or with few sets of people, you would normally see that in this case, the centralized structure would apply, wherein it will be an exact opposite, wherein management would normally be responsible for taking decisions on major areas, and that is where that structure would also fall through within any of the 4 different types. Now, there are other definitions of when I say these are different types of structures of organizations which could be required or be seen in a business company or an organization because of the specialist function or the type of industry or the sector in which the organization actually operates. So when you look at organizations which have a coordinating structure, so in this case, you would generally see organizations which produce an output, and that is becoming an input for another department. They produce and work on it, again provide it to the next department, which then looks at working further on it, and then it finishes it and produces a product. And some of the other types would be re-engineering, in terms of some organizations would be termed as wherein the structure of the organization has been re-engineered or simplified, from a complex structure to make things work. And one such example is that when we look at the company like Dell or Dell Computers, before Dell Computers came into being, you normally saw that the ordering of the PC, this is a bit of an old example, but I'll give you a fresh and a new example. But when you looked at when Dell came into the business, before that, if you had to buy a PC in the 1990s or early 2000s, build-to-order concept was not available. You cannot go. You would not have the option of going onto the website, choosing what memory component, graphics card, hard drive, monitor size, keyboard you needed. You can assemble all of it together, and then click on it to pay for it. And 2 or 3 days, depending on the location or the geography you were in, the PC used to arrive. And that model became very successful. But in some cases, so what Dell did, they looked at the example of IBM, Hewlett-Packard, Compaq, lots of other companies which were present at that point in time. And they looked at these companies, and what they said was that the way it is organized in terms of how products reach the consumer or the businesses takes a lot of time. And what they did was they re-engineered the structure in some of the organizations to study them, and then brought that into their own organization, wherein they did away with a lot of middle part of the layers within the organization to make it direct to consumer. So when we talk about re-engineering in particular, what we are looking at is the company is shedding off layers. The company is looking at taking on competition head on. In some cases, the company is also looking at going directly to vendors or suppliers, and wants to cut out the middlemen, and that speeds up the whole operational side of things within the organization. And that is where we see Dell doing that. And in some cases, sometimes you have management consultants or people who come in and work within the organization. They would normally come in and start looking at doing a bit of re-engineering. They would start come in and do a bit of delayering, identify which areas are in excess, which areas are not contributing or are not required, and that is where they start to look at cutting in, obviously proposing things in order to make the organizations more leaner and meaner. And that is where you would see this particular thing coming across. Now, in the modern term and context, we also look at two other terms in particular. One is networked organization, and the other is looking at atomized organization. So when I talk about network organization is one that is connected by informal networks. And in terms of, working together, they have a softer or a dotted line structure within the different departments and teams which work. And an example of this would be, again, looking at software side of organizations or organizations which are huge and have lots of operations in different countries, and they have lots of departments. You normally see, and a case in point that I would take is, if you look at, say, Samsung as an organization. They're based out of Korea, but obviously they have global operations in maybe 190, 200 countries. But you would generally see most products either coming from the US side or from the Korean side. And once the products are introduced, there is somebody who's sitting in that organization, which is a global product manager. But he continues to work with his counterparts, which are based in different geographies. So you might be working for Samsung, or if you look at Sony, you might be working for them in the Middle East, but you might be reporting on a dotted line structure to the administrative head in that region, but your functional head would be somebody in the head office because you are a part and parcel of his team or his virtual team. So in this case, you basically report administratively to somebody, but you also work, parallelly with your counterpart, which is maybe from the same department, same function, or maybe the same category of products that you're bringing to market. So when you look at that kind of working which is present within an organization, wherein you might be reporting into somebody administratively, but functionally working with colleagues or different types of people which are based elsewhere in the company or in a large organization, then in those cases you would generally see a network or a softer structure working within the organization. This would be also seen in a virtual organization. You would see a network structure because a lot of people would be connected and working for the company, but sometimes when you see a receptionist role or somebody who's in the administration, a call comes, she's the one which links up any call which is coming from outside to any one person or one department within the organization. And that is where I would say that these organizations which are virtual in nature or are very large because of the products and functions they are, the way they are categorized, and they sell different products and services to consumers globally, they would have a network or a softer dotted line structure, as I would put it, because of the way they are working and oriented. Now, the atomized organization would be that there are, groups which are created within various departments, and there are further groups created in order to ease up the operations. So sometimes you would look at, very specialist functions, and in these specialist functions, you would see a number of groups working parallelly or against each other to bring products and services out to the market. And the manager there decides which one will essentially be the idea which will take forth and go forward. So a practical example of this I would give you is, if you look at software organizations or companies which work within a productized structure, you generally see that a lot of parallel teams will be looking at working on products. And a case in point, an example that I will give you, because it's normally in the news and you'll be able to relate to that, is when you look at iPhone, when you look at Samsung, when you look at Huawei, some of these big companies will bring out products. Now, there's always a lot of speculation around what new product and is coming out, or what are the features going to be in that product. So if I talk about the iPhone, every 18 months we know that they bring out a new product, and there's a lot of speculation around that time frame that no, they are bringing out this phone, it's going to have these features. Obviously, these are all leaked pieces of information. Nobody gets to know exactly what comes out, but there are various versions of it which we get to hear sometimes, because the information gets out. And what happens in this case is, what product will actually make it to the market would be dependent on the merits and what it meets in terms of customer requirement. But there'll be different opposing teams which will be working on different versions of that product, but nobody can put a hand on it until the manager or the top management decides that this one is going to be the model which is going to be launched. So you have an iPhone 13A, you have a 13B, a 13C, a 13D. They have different features, but we know that most of these would have a 5G network. They'll have some, functionality on higher processor, this and that. But whether we'll see a foldable phone, whether we'll see, a phone which will have a back screen, the front being color, the back being black and white, there are lots of these things at work. And because these teams are based and working on individual different products, which one finally leaves the organization in terms of being the product going to market would be dependent on certain successive factors which the top management would decide. How innovative is it? How closely it meets the requirements of consumer research, which they have done over the years to see what should be the features in the next model? How does it tackle the competition? Lots of other things. So this kind of an organization on which decision making is based on some sort of calculations. I want to use the word mathematical modeling, but it basically is based on certain background calculations and research. Then in those cases, you would generally see organizations working with what is called the atomized structure within the organization. Now, this kind of an organization would be present within Apple as well. This might be present within Google as well. This might be present within, lots of other different types of organizations, because the idea which is the data light of the day would be the most meritorious idea, and it will be decided on the basis of calculations which are done by marketing, by product engineering, by software engineering, or whatever different people within the management, because they'll be looking at calculating what is the probability of this being successful, how near is it to or close is it to the expectations of the consumer, and how will it help us define or say counter the competitive market when it is introduced as a product from their stable. So atomized structure, in short, there are lots of ways to market, lots of products which can be brought in, but it will depend on the calculations which will be done in order to ensure which one is the most suitable and which one is going to be the most optimum to bring to the market from a success point of view. And that is where you would see small teams working opposite each other to bring out the same kind of product, but the decision would be dependent on how profitable that product would be or how successful that product would be for the organization. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Any questions so far?
No.
Okay, let's quickly dwell into the second assessment criteria, and this is predominantly theoretical. So here we need to understand some frameworks and some models. Now, the second part focuses on, after we've understood structures, we want to understand what is the culture, what is the culture of the organization. Now, when we talk about culture, we don't, in terms of definition, we talk about it can be defined as an image, a style, a logo, a belief, and a symbol, which basically defines what the organization stands for. Now, sometimes you see a symbol. So most of the Apple products, for example, if I stick to this, what we've discussed today, they have an Apple logo on most of their products. You look at Samsung, they have the 6 rings or, some sort of a depiction which is there for most of the, products that they have as a bit of a, symbol that helps recognize that brand. So when we talk about, culture could be a a combination of n number of these things, which could be values, beliefs, attitudes, behaviors, symbols, which you get to see within a particular brand. Now, why is culture important? The culture is important because it basically helps leaders and managers manage, the performance of the employees, the motivation level of the employees, or how motivated they are, how loyal they are towards the organization. And in some cases, it also helps them tweak efficiency and productivity within the organization. Now, when we talk about different cultures, there could be, very many different types of cultures. But broadly, if I classify them, there could be organizations, depending on which structure they follow. There could be organizations which are bureaucratic. There could be organizations which are collaborative, showing collaborative culture. So I've just taken two examples. And organizations which will be highly bureaucratic would be organizations in which either there will be a hierarchical culture or a structure, or organizations in which you would generally see that here the employees are asked to follow very strict procedures and rules, and everything is down to the T. So a lot of policies, procedures are all written, and in those cases, what you would see is that the organization expects the individual to essentially follow those procedures when they are doing or discharging their day-to-day responsibilities. Then you look at collaborative side of culture. Collaborative side of culture would be in organizations wherein, there is a lot of teamwork, closeness in terms of decision making, decentralization, so that decision making moves from, depending on what output or what kind of people with skills are involved in, doing the work. And in those cases, you would see collaborative culture, because the output of one team or the department becomes an input, or in some cases a number of departments have to work on the product before it becomes a finalized or a finished product or service that can be sold to customers. Now, broadly speaking, the idea of culture has been studied by a number of philosophers and scientists over the years, and people who are various psychologists. So we look at three broad types in today's discussion. One is Charles Handy's, framework of organizational culture that he came up with. Now, he did a lot of research, and his approach was that in organizations, depending on, the type of structure they have and, where the delegation of authority and resting of a power is, or decision-making power is, you would generally see four types of cultures coming across. And he named them as power, role, task, and people, or person's culture. Now, each of these I've defined, and I've related them to, what is called, what type of structure they come from. So when we talk about power culture, without going into specifics, power culture generally is depictive of the fact that the decision-making power or the authority is concentrated in very few people's hands, or maybe, a very limited number of people within the organization. Now, you would generally see that in power culture, focus is on task-based, approach, wherein work needs to get done. And in those cases, people would also be in a position to, authorize or allow different, let's say different variability of decision-making basis, budgeting, time limits and things which could be allowed, because the focus is on achieving the task, completing the task. Obviously, because the power or the decision-making authority is vested into one or very few individual, decision-making is fast. In some cases, you would generally see that in some organizations which are startups, small organizations, or when you look at budgeting side of things, budgetary responsibility, it's all, with the owner of the organization or the, the director of the organization. Now, this kind of a culture is also seen in large organizations, and we've seen some examples of these in organizations which have become quite concentric in terms of being, leader driven or top management driven. So when you look at Bob Diamond, he was seen as one of the most promising individuals in the financial, sector or financial industry, but had to resign as head of Barclays operation because of, the LIBOR scandal which happened. So he has a very illustrious career within this field of 35 years, but, because there was too much decision making concentrated with him, at the end of the day, when this decision, of London interbanking rate, backfired, he had to resign from the organization. So there are some repercussions of having too much power being, or absolute power being, within one or a few set of people, and that tends to be the negative of, power culture. We also see that happening in RBS. We also see that happening in Enron, because here the culture was quite strong and it was power-driven, authority-driven, and we see that these organizations did not budge from the leadership or the direction which the leaders set, and that is why some of these organizations, also perished. Then we look at role culture. So in this case, the most important reason why this culture comes across is that the organization functions basically on some sort of rules and regulations which are laid down as policies and procedures within the context of running it. And here, the role is important because the position the person has and the delegation power or the responsibility that the authority, that the responsibility that the person has is in the position rather than in the person. So the difference between role and person power culture is that here the power is concentrated in the position rather than the person. The other thing that you would also look at is this tends to be in hierarchical organizations wherein the decision making becomes a bit more bureaucratic, and also in some cases the organization takes very fewer risks because they feel that going outside their comfort level would not be beneficial for them in the long run. Then we see a task culture. In task culture, you generally see this in functional organizations or productized structures, project teams, flat organizations also. And here the teams basically are focused on solving specific problems or completing specific tasks. And the power here shifts from department to department. So when the project is being formed or a project team is being formed, the lead project manager would have most of the decision-making power. But when the field work starts, for example, in a construction company, then you would generally see that the field project managers would wield more power and responsibility because they are dealing with certain aspects of ensuring the completion on timelines and the budgeting which has been set, and they would be taking more decisions on a day-to-day basis. When the building is coming up to finishing, you would generally see materials managers or people which are responsible for the furnishing of the building or the office or whatever it is, will be taking more or wielding more power, is because in those cases, their task is to minimize waste. Their task is to look at minimizing expenses and making sure that the forecasting and the budgeting which is being done to procure materials are predominantly done with the right, quantity in mind. And in those cases, you would see they would essentially work and maybe use or wield more power. Now, this kind of a structure could also, this is a structure or task culture can actually be seen in lots of different types of structures. So this could be seen in divisional, you could have this in matrix, in flat, and also in hierarchical organizations. Where sometimes you would see in Apple, which is most, say, hierarchically driven productized structure. But if a product launch for a high value product like an iPhone or a new iPad or an iMac is happening, you would see a team being pulled together from lots of different departments, which will be the global product launch team. They'll go into different countries, do the launch, the central one happening in say in the US in California and their main head office. But post that, the countries will slowly be open and there'll be a team which will be responsible for doing that rollout. And their task would be to make sure that the product launch and the availability of the product becomes successful throughout the course of the introduction. The product is being done for a successive number of weeks. And in those cases, you would see task culture, because in this case, the power would shift from different teams, from the US team once the launch has been done, to the European team, to the Middle Eastern team, to the Asia team, and things like that. And then we look at person culture. So in this case, what happens is the organizations essentially look at, believing that people themselves are superior to the business. The businesses exist because of people working together. So this kind of a person culture you would see in, consultancy organizations. You would generally see this in, partnership firms, wherein you have different sets of people which actually come together because they're performing essentially the same kind of work. So you would see that the organization would have a person culture, because if the person leaves, the business might also collapse. So an example is, if you look at a partnership firm for, say, solicitors or lawyers, different lawyers come together because they are doing pretty much the same function. But yes, because of the specialist function they do, finance, immigration, family, commercial, IP, if one of them is to leave, you would normally see that that side of the business within the, the team would collapse. So in those cases, you would see the culture is a person-led culture, because the people generally in that organization feel that the business exists because of them. They are superior to the business. And in those cases, this kind of a culture lies, because they have the ability, because of their skills and knowledge, to be able to drive the business. Any questions on this so far?
Yeah, then what is the major difference between role culture and task culture? Like, they both seem to be quite similar, just maybe the definitions are a little different.
So
Like
in
one
role
goes,
culture,
okay.
there are very clear differences. In role culture, you would generally see that the organization is highly controlled because of the fact that they are very well established as a business. And in this case, there is a clear procedural, let's say an employee handbook is provided to an employee when he joins the organization, and clearly do's and don'ts are, depicted in that particular handbook. And you're expected to, adhere to those terms and conditions, or those rules and responsibilities which have been required to do so when you're doing your, day-to-day duties. So here, the main aspect is that the person's position or the role that you do, the power is actually positioned in the person's role. So if you become vice president marketing, the power that you get is because you're vice president marketing in the organization, not because you have, over the years come up to that position, but because at that position you have the authority to be able to take budgetary decisions, decide what is to be done, and, responsible. That is why it is role culture. In task culture, it's focused on tasks. So sometimes in projectized teams or in organizations, you would generally see that tasks are having an overarching, let's say, importance than the role within the organization or the responsibility that you have in the organization. And the organization focuses on completion and achievement of the task. So here, the power or the responsibility in terms of decision making can shift from one person to the other, or one department to the other, depending on what role they are playing at that stage when the, say for example, the role at that stage which is being completed within the organization. So here I give an example of, say, a product launch which a company decides to do. They pull in people from marketing, sales, HR, look at advertising, they look at engineering, manufacturing. They all come together as a team. Now, at some stage, the power in terms of, decision-making authority will move from different to different people. But the budgeting would have been already done for the launch. That's the overall budget which has been signed off by the CEO or the managing director, and that they have to manage within that. But yes, which agency you choose will be decided by maybe the advertising side of things, what budget is allocated. Then in that case, that person would normally look at the objective set and decide. When it comes to looking at press release, when it looks at deciding, say, for example, what people to invite, what press to invite, then it will be somebody else's role. So in those cases, the decision making will shift from person to person and will be focused on it, making sure that the contribution that they do in the achievement of the task has, the right, let's say, the parameters for them to be able to succeed. So here, people chosen in that team.
I understood this task culture and role culture. But as now you explained me role culture, now I have confusion between power and role. Like now they both seem to be similar.
So in power culture, you would generally see that this is applicable in organizations which are hierarchical. So very few people would have, the ability to make decisions. Role culture would be specific to people wherein the documentation and guidelines are very clearly defined. What is to be done when, this happens? You refer to a rule book, or you refer to the policies and procedures within the organization. A power culture example is a small organization or a large organization, but it is driven centrally by the owner or the top management. because the decision making is centered in very few people or at the top end of the organization. Role culture is everybody knows their roles and responsibilities are defined. There is no concept of absolute power within the organization. Depending on the role that the person or the position the person occupies, that would allow certain responsibilities and certain bits in terms of exercising that can be done to take decisions. And that is where role will take importance. When it comes to task, the task which the responsibility or the organization's ability to be able to do a particular task or complete a particular task would take a precedence. And when you talk about person, here the person is more important than the business. So the four bits give you the four hints. Person is the most important in the organization. You look at task, it is the most important function within the organization. So when tasks are done, if I ask the industry or the company to produce to construct a house, you would generally see tasks would move. The main task is to construct the house in, say, a time frame of 30 days, 40 days, whatever it is. But there'll be different teams working within the construction of the house. So somebody would be looking at building the house foundation, somebody would be looking at the walls, somebody would be looking at. But there, what you're going to see is that the decision-making authority would be passed on as a baton, depending on which part of the project is complete, and then which person takes that precedence or the department takes that precedence. So this is something that you can understand by reading a handout, and obviously I think some of the bits that I've mentioned on the slides would make it quite clear. So here we are looking at relating it to the structure of the organization, and that is what would help you understand why Charles Handy came across with these four different types of culture he identified. Now, we look at very briefly Hofstede. Now, Gerard Hofstede is, he was a Dutch scientist, and he basically came up with a framework because he did a study of IBM and IBM's organizational working in 50 different countries. And because of the workings that he did, he came up with the framework that sometimes you would see the culture of the society, or also basically a culture present in a particular location or geography, which is the society's culture, would have reflection or bearing on the culture of the organization. And this would be basis the fact that individuals depict a certain type of behavior when they are working in a particular setup and they come from a particular geography. So sometimes when we talk about diversity, when we talk about people working within an organization, but they come from different regions or different parts of the world, you generally see that they bring certain beliefs, attitudes, behaviors, and a way of working within the organization because they've been groomed, trained, and they've acquired skill in a particular environment. So this is where he came up with this cultural dimension theory, and the framework which he proposed was that sometimes organizational cultures would be influenced by society's culture and from where and what values people bring into the organization because of their background. And what he proposed was, in the framework, these 6 dimensions which basically help define the culture of the organization. So there's a bit of a handout, but theoretically what we need to understand is, because of the study that he did with IBM in particular, within 50 countries, and he came across with these 6 different types. Initially he invented 4, and then he later on added additionally 2, and that is where he said that the culture of the organization is influenced by society's culture and the background of the individuals which work within the organization and where they come from. So these 6 dimensions that he defined were power distance index, collectivism versus individualism, uncertainty. He looked at femininity versus masculinity, short-term versus long-term, and restraint versus indulgence. Now, this is a huge experiment that he's done by studying a number of employees within IBM and in 50 different locations, and that is where he came up with this balanced approach that these 6 factors essentially help decide the culture of the organization. So sometimes an example of this would be, sometimes you see teams of the same company. If you pick up one company and you see teams within different geographies of the same company might show very aggressive behavior, or they might be quite different in terms of workings. So you see a team which works in China within the company, or a group of people which work within a team, and you see a group of team working within Japan, you see a group of team working within India, Middle East, Europe, Africa, and other places, you generally see that sometimes some teams come out quite aggressive, in the sense individuals, because the way the market is structured, it's a growing market, it's a developing market, there is obviously economic growth happening, and a lot of factors affect that. So what he came up with the concept in this framework was that when we look at a nation's culture, we look at the background which people come from and what behavior and attitude they show, this helps influence and form the organizational culture of that business unit, or of that branch office, or of that particular geographical office, because they are going to be influencing the culture of the organization. And these 6 dimensions broadly is where he said it could be classified as low or high. So on an x-axis, he kind of, let's say, portrayed them to say, if I talk about power distance, what I essentially mean by power distance, when we talk about, one such aspect would be that it refers to the degree of inequality that exists. So here, what will happen is you'll have inequality, which will basically influence, the working of the people. There'll be a few set of people with power within the organization in that geography, and there'll be a few set of people which will be without power or any authority to be able to make decisions. And this particular bit was translated into a score. And when I say PDI, or power distance index, which he created, so he classified that into low or high. So people with low, let's say, ability to be able to make power or make decisions, essentially were termed as egalitarian. And people which has high, which showed or had high decision-making authority, were people which basically said, were said to have high power index, and they were embracing hierarchy. So when we talk about this particular aspect of egalitarian versus embracing hierarchy, this was measured as a power distance index, whether you're showing low or high, because some people have the decision-making power, and they believe that all of us equally should be looking and making that decision. If they are bending towards that side of philosophy, then they were showing egalitarian philosophy in the power distance index. And people, when they were bending towards, no, I have the responsibility, I have the ability to be able to make that decision, were actually embracing hierarchy, and they were not keen on sharing power with other people. So this index also is seen working within this particular framework, or as we say, the 6 dimensions that is proposed, is also seen working within different organizations, and it is also important. So when we talk about culture within an organization, you'd normally see Charles Handy's framework being talked about, and you'll see Gerhard Hofstede's framework being talked about, because we get to see reflections of these within different global organizations in particular. Because when you look at culture, when we look at society, or the background from which individuals come from, they reflect and affect the culture of the organization. Now, the third one that we want to briefly look at is Mintzberg. And he also did a bit of work to understand what kind of culture can be progressed within the organization, or what kind of culture, structure the working of the organization how could it affect the culture of the organization. So he came across with 3 broad dimensions, and these included, workings within the organization. How does the coordination mechanism or operational activities work within the organization, and how decentralized the decision-making process is. And he considered these 3 variables to come up with 5 structural configurations that he proposed, which basically develop in terms of culture of the organization. And I've kind of, highlighted that in this particular matrix. So when you look at a simple structure, machine bureaucracy, professional bureaucracy, divisional form, and adhocracy, these are the 5 different types he proposed. And then what kind of key attributes or characteristics they show, and what kind of effect they have on the culture of the organization is basically compared or showcased across certain variables that he took. So things like environment, internal factors, key building blocks, and key mechanisms which operate within the organization. And he classified them across these 5 different structure types. So this is theoretical, and you need to be able to understand that, again, when we talk about culture within the organization, this is something that we need to look at predominantly to see and sense that, okay, when we see the workings of the organization taking importance in terms of what role does the individual play in the success and failure of the organization, or when we talk about the operational activities, if they are given more precedence within the organization, or last but not the least, if there is decentralization in the decision making process, then you get to see that in those kind of organizations you would normally have these 5 different kind of structures which would primarily develop. And this is where the classification of Mintzberg 5 organizational structures comes about, which is slightly different to hierarchical, tall, matrix, functional, and divisional that we talk about. So he came up with his own structure, and he said, okay, the structure of the organization can only be looked at not in isolation, but when we consider what kind of culture it depicts, and that is where this came about. Now, last but not the least, we look at Pedlar's learning organization structure. Now, he came across with a lot of work that he has done, wherein he facilitates that companies in the 21st century are going to be successful if they are able to adapt, and they are learning organizations. So his structure in terms of culture, essentially how it helps develop within the organization, is called the Pedlar's learning organization. Why do we write Athe? Because there were a number of people in his team which worked on it. So we had people, who are key contributors to this particular framework, which came about, is called the Pedlar's, structure. Now, he developed 11 characteristics, which he talks about in general, and these characteristics help the company and the business and the organization adapt into various different situations, competitive environments, and still be successful. And that is where he says that employees, individuals, staff, suppliers, partners always need to be looking at training and development. Now, whether it's self-managed training, whether it's training done by the organization, and that helps its staff and people to, perform their activities to the best, and that brings out efficiency because you're putting emphasis on training and development, within the organization to be able to adapt to changing scenarios which the organization faces, either because of globalization or because of competitive activities. Now, to explain some of these structures, I've taken up an example of Tesco. And if you look at this particular example and go through the slides, you would generally see what kind of culture Tesco as an organization in the UK actually exhibits. And this tends to be, focused on 2 facts. One, efficiency, performance, and productivity. And when we look at Pedlar's side of the model and apply this to this particular aspect, what you will also see is that also creates motivation for the employees working within the organization, because it shows that the organization cares and, is basically involved in training and reskilling the individuals to be able to perform their function or the responsibility given to the best of their capability. So it is predominantly related to understanding, if you know the culture and you are able to help build a specific culture depending on the structure in the organization, it helps to increase the performance of the individuals or staff within the organization. Any questions on this?
No.
Okay, the last one that we are looking at is basically the application of what we've seen in terms of structure and in terms of culture. And by taking an example, you would be looking at completing this task, which is the merit criteria, because it says evaluation of the relevance of organizational culture in developing organizational effectiveness. So here, broadly, I've taken 6 different examples. So here the 4 points essentially, and with one example of a company, we'll be able to look at how these are going to help in building effectiveness in the operations for that organization. Now, when we talk about the effectiveness of the organization and the operations in particular, we look at various variables, and these could be, sometimes you look at organizations that are focused predominantly on objectives. So if a new company is launching operation in a new geography, existing company launches operation in a new geography, they are focused on achieving a strategic objective. There could be situations wherein sometimes you would see organizations would like to build diversity within the organization. That means they would want to bring in people from different cultures, different geographies, in order to expand the diversity or the knowledge pool within the organization. Sometimes you would see that organizations would look at focusing on future strategy, and that could be under merger and acquisition, and they are eyeing out, say, for example, taking over a particular company for a bit of time, and there are lots of things which go into it in terms of research happening, in terms of collecting data, and also ensuring that, okay, if this business is to be taken over, how does it add value to the company or increase its product portfolio and offering to the market, and how does it help reduce maybe competition. Technology is a great leveler. So obviously when we look at evaluation of effectiveness today, basic things in terms of IT, are required, and most organizations cannot do away with the utilization of IT and IT infrastructure in terms of the day-to-day functions which employees actually carry out in terms of doing their responsibilities. So whether it's a small example of, a company advertising a sales manager role, wherein the manager is required to travel and meet a lot of clients in a particular area. So sometimes you would see the company's job adverts carry company car and company mobile phone provided. Now, to add to that, you see laptops and other bits which have now become pretty much part and parcel, is because they are considered basic, requirements for the employee to be able to connect to the office or, share information or essentially work in certain locations. So when we look at technology has become a clear indicator of how a company would look at increasing or say making sure effectiveness is there within the operations. Now, in the 21st century, you see a lot of organizations, especially when HR puts out job adverts, they look at clearly identifying and advertising the skills which are required as against being generic job descriptions if you look at 10 years back. And this change has happened over the last decade is because organizations are increasingly becoming specialists in terms of demanding the, let's say, the human resource which is required to do that job or that function. So as I gave an example earlier was that if you're applying to a programmer's role in any software organization, you generally see in the job advert, the skills are going to be clearly advertised which are required to get into that particular role. And organizations which have global operations would be focused on clearly talking about things like have worked in a similar job profile or a role, has worked across different locations, have traveled, say extensively in certain countries or locations, and that would be definitions to, or tips providing to the candidates applying that in order to get this role, you are required to show these skills or this particular experience, which is a bare minimum requirement to look at, bagging that role. So when we look at all these things, we look at how organization is basically looking at clearly defining the effectiveness that they are trying to achieve by using some of these things in, say, for example, a job advert. So they're advertising diversity, they're advertising some part of it in terms of explaining that what is the future strategy, why the role has come up. You'd be looking at, putting some skills down in terms of whether you know this language, have you worked on this platform, are you aware of this, and that would be technology. And in some cases, they would be looking at transferable skills, which would be your experience, your prior working in an organization or a similar environment, and that would be advertised in order to see whether you are going to be effective in that role or not. Now, when we have to apply this, we sometimes also see that a lot of organizations would put us through some sort of an aptitude test. What they would do is, have you had this situation wherein you've, if you applied for a job and a company has sent you a test to do or an aptitude test to do?
Yeah, I have
Right.
these couple of times. Yeah.
Right. So when you look at that, why do you think is the reason why the organizations actually ask you to do that test?
Just to see your analytical mind. I don't know what's the actual reason. I've never
So
understood
let me
that.
clarify. Yes, that is a good example of what you have mentioned. So sometimes these tests are personality driven. Sometimes these tests are aptitude tests, which is to test your skills, and what you've actually written in the CV is actually what you can do. So in some cases, like in software programmers, they'll ask you to program a particular, they'll ask you to code a particular small piece of program, and that would be used as an aptitude. So there are different types of tests. There could be personality tests, there could be aptitude tests, there could be tests which are generally getting to know your personality and whether you would fit into the organizational structure and culture of the organization. Sometimes you get to hear these words. Go on.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say. That sometimes we hear these words that you are not a cultural fit, this person cannot fit in the work culture. So, what exactly does that statement mean?
So when you look at these, sentences or phrases being used, what tends to happen is that the organization, which has, different types of cultures, when we look at handy culture, so what they're trying to do is they're trying to try and seek a candidate joining the organization which are very close to the structure and culture of the organization. So what they do is they put you through these personality tests which were developed by Myers and Briggs, and in some cases they test aptitude tests which are basically testing your skills. So when you the reason this is primarily to ensure that they are not getting somebody into the organization which is going to be, not receptive to taking, say, let's say, delegation. How would they handle responsibility? How would they handle power? Would they be receptive to, take commands or, instructions from superiors? Whether they are going to be fixed, whether they're going to be open-minded, and all these things actually come across from the various tests the organizations normally put you through. So in most organizations nowadays, it is accepted that if you're joining at the senior level, mid to senior level, you're normally going to be put through a personality test. And what they look at is that matrix of Hofstede, index, which is the 6 dimensions. So they want to see that you're not on any sort of extreme. You're not extremely, aggressive. You're not extremely extrovert, or you are not very passionate. So what they want to see is a right mix and a balance. So when we look at the Hofstede 6, framework, the 6 qualities framework he talks about, the organizations are looking at finding individuals within a particular score, which is weighting not the high scores of 90s or 95s. They're looking at somewhere in the middle of 60s to 80s, and that would be very close to their index of how they define their organization works, what kind of a structure it is, what kind of delegation of power they have, how people work within teams, what kind of decision making is decentralized, and they would expect that individual to basically understand all this. And the reason why they do these tests is to get a glimpse of, when you do these tests, you are basically giving them an insight into your personality. And obviously skills tests or aptitude based tests are primarily giving direct confirmation to the skills or the experience that you write in your CV, and that is what they would want to infer. They don't want to say, okay, I've got 5 years of experience in designing applications, but then they ask me to design a simple code for a calculator. I can't do it, so obviously I don't have the skills, and what's been written on the CV is totally false. So in those cases, you would generally see organizations would use these tests as a precursor to look at, as a first stage elimination to be done, to see individuals whether they will fit in the organization culture, whether they'll be a good organizational fit into the structure of the organization, and that is where this comes in. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
in this part, I think the learning outcome focuses predominantly on understanding the different structures. You need to be able to have one organization in mind that you are very well versed with, and you can understand that organization from a point of view of structure and culture. You could use your own company or the company that you work in, and that would be helpful when you come to the assignment, because in those cases, the idea is the task 2.1 and 2.3 are purely theoretical, so you need to be able to explain and cover them descriptively. But in 2M1, we are going to be looking at picking up a particular organization. You could pick up Apple, Microsoft, that I've given you examples of, And obviously, there's plenty of data available on their structure and culture, and that is what you'll be required to evaluate by taking an example, providing advantages and disadvantages, and then making a decision that basis what I've seen, what I've presented, or evidence as presented as evidence, I can clearly conclude that this organization shows this culture, and that is why it is effective in terms of driving its products and services in the market. Okay, so I'll get this copy of the presentation and obviously the recording uploaded later today as it becomes available, and there'll be one or two small handouts which I will also upload, which will be on the framework, the Hofstede framework for more detailing, the Charles Handy's framework, and the Henry Mintzberg's framework on the organizational structure and culture, just to understand them in a bit more detail.
Okay, perfect.
Brilliant. So I'll catch up with you next week. Thanks for joining.
Yeah,
go on.
I had one question. It was regarding